The story begins with the fact that long ago a stranger appeared in one village, which was later written about in the diary of a local resident. A man with a cold-blooded stare arrived at the village, but no one greeted him cordially. There was an undercurrent of anger in his eyes, as if he'd been through an ordeal. Although one hoped he would be kicked out, the village chief accepted him without further question. 4 days passed, and the newcomer behaved so quietly that he seemed not to exist at all. Some of the villagers, without concealing their curiosity, discussed the stranger, but the narrator was not at all interested in this. It had been a full week, 10 days to be exact, since he had appeared in the village. The children who watched him furtively said that he was honing his sword skills every day. Looking at him, you'd think he had a complicated past, and maybe that was true. Yet the narrator felt no special interest in this man. Another month passed, but everything remained the same. The man continued to train in the yard. People never stopped gossiping. Some said he was out for revenge, others called him a fallen knight or mercenary. The narrator didn't pay much attention to these rumors, but they annoyed him. The next day, he decided to watch him hone his skills himself. The stranger hadn't missed a single day of training in 6 months, and now it was hard not to be interested. How fast was he? How strong was he? The narrator felt disappointment, deep and complete, as if he had waited in vain for something more. Someone not versed in swords might be impressed, but to the narrator, who had seen quite a few swordsmen, the technique seemed mediocre. Perhaps he had a reason, a heavy past so sad it was heartbreaking. But all these efforts seemed futile, and he himself looked pathetic and foolish, and the narrator decided not to think of him anymore. At this time, a new family arrived in the village, a former mercenary with his son and daughter. The mercenary's daughter's name was Rima, and her smile was so radiant that the narrator resolved by all means to speak to her the next day. Meanwhile, the stranger continued his daily training, and it had been 3 years since his arrival in the village. The narrator suddenly felt something strange and, giving in to this feeling, took up his pen for the first time in a long time. He courted Rema for 2 years and then married her, finding complete happiness. But strangely enough, even now he was still haunted by thoughts of a man with whom he had nothing in common. 5 years is a long time in which the lives of many have changed, but he still stood in the courtyard, raising his sword time after time. Another month and 12 days passed, and he kept practicing as if time didn't matter. For months and 15 days later, everything was still the same. The sword strikes hadn't stopped for a day. Years passed, and 6 years, 2 months and 18 days later, he was still honing his skills the same way, even under the cover of night. 6 years, 9 months and 3 days later, when the snow covered the earth, he did not stop, continuing his endless journey. Rema gave birth to a daughter, Lyra, and the whole village gathered to congratulate them on this happy event. But while everyone rejoiced in his new life, he continued his endless training as before. 7 years, 10 months and 27 days had passed, but his sword knew no rest. Suddenly the world was filled with a blinding light, as if something unknown had broken through the boundaries of reality. And even when the sky broke into rain, he still stood in the courtyard without stopping swinging his sword. Today is the 15th anniversary of the day he began his training. The narrator caught himself thinking that he hadn't even checked to see if he was still studying today. As the sun rises in the morning and the moon illuminates the night, so his training became something constant. The narrator realized it was time to stop thinking about it, because none of it made sense. But life went on. His granddaughter woke him up with warm words, and he answered her with a smile. Grandpa smilingly asked his grandson not to pester him since morning. Rema told her son it was time to pack, and he happily agreed, greeting his father. Grandpa asked where they were going and learned that the family was going to the market in a neighboring village. Rema offered him to go together, but he declined, deciding to stay home. Looking out the window, Grandpa thought that maybe he should just walk around the village. Grandpa was enjoying the fresh air, noting what a beautiful day it was. As he walked, villagers greeted him, asking about business, but he only politely declined invitations. As he walked along the familiar paths, he thought about how much the village had changed over the years. But something remained the same, and it was a place that drew his gaze, making him stop. Before him loomed a ramshackle gate, hidden in the greenery, and he stood involuntarily on the threshold of memory. Grandpa wondered if it had been about 37 years since he had first seen this gate. His gaze lingered on the old door, but a sudden sound made him turn around sharply. The door creaked open, and he rushed in without thinking, as if obeying some sudden impulse. As he stopped, he was breathing heavily and his heart was beating frantically in his chest with excitement. His hand clutched something hard with trembling fingers, as if trying to grasp at reality. He was on his knees, clutching the sword all the way down, as if he had merged with the weapon as one. His eyes remained wide open, and even in the face of the inevitable, he didn't unclench his fingers. The narrator could not look away. gazing endlessly into the motionless figure. As the silvery glow around him faded, the storyteller gently laid him down on the ground. And then, leaning down, gently closed his eyes so he could finally rest. The narrator mentally wished the deceased peace as he saw him off on his final journey. But suddenly someone's eyes darted open, and the next instant there was a sharp gasp of arousal. The young man sat up abruptly on the bed, breathing heavily, trying to realize if it was just a dream. Outside the room spread Farer Manor, a busy place in the southern part of the Kingdom of Hail. This city was not just a trading center between kingdoms, but was known for something much more. The guards were discussing Baron Ferrera's children, marveling at the heights they had reached. One of them told with admiration that Lily Cyril, who was only 11 years old, had been given the title of wizard. Another incredulously asked how valuable true spellcasters were, but he was immediately cut off by a reminder that they were rarer than great mages. However, not everyone was impressed by this news, as the firstborn of the family was still Lord Iron. After such a heated conversation, the guards suddenly fell silent, realizing that they had become engrossed in idle arguments. The older guard irritated the younger one, rebuking him for talking in front of the new recruit, but the latter only grinned, deciding not to argue. Although Lily Cyril was already a household name, what drew even more attention was her older brother, Irene Ferrera. He was popularly called the Lazy Lord, for in his entire life he showed no aspirations. After his mother's death he hardly left his room until he was 15, only sleeping endlessly. It seemed understandable, for the loss had happened before his eyes, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. One of the guards noticed the commotion among his subordinates and asked sharply what was going on here. His harsh tone startled the younger guard, who instantly tensed, realizing his mistake. Meanwhile, Lily Ferrera and Baroness Amelia, the Baron's second wife, were approaching them. Lily reminded her in a cold voice that such disturbances were not allowed on duty. The guards bowed instantly, begging for forgiveness, but heard only a fair rebuke in return. The guards glanced anxiously around, waiting for punishment while the Baroness calmly asked what to do about their misbehavior. Lily turned indignantly to her mother, insisting that the soldiers deserved a harsher punishment. But the Baroness smiled softly, assuring them that they had already realized their mistake, and that was enough. The guards hastily agreed, bowing their heads, and the Baroness reminded them that it was a good idea to concentrate on work while on duty. Finished talking, she and Lily calmly headed onward, leaving the tense guards behind. The guards looked at each other in silence, still feeling tense after their conversation with Lily and the Baroness. They breathed a sigh of relief, barely able to stay on their feet after such a nerve-wracking ordeal. One of them remarks that Lily is incredibly intelligent and the future of Ferrera Manor is in safe hands, though the Baroness also inspires fear. However, the other guard hesitated, for Iron Ferrera did not look like them at all. Meanwhile, Iron abruptly got up from the bed, exclaiming irritably as if he was tired of everything that was going on. Iron was breathing heavily, feeling strangely agitated. He couldn't manage to fall asleep, though it usually happened on its own. He sat on the bed, amazed that he did not feel the usual drowsiness, for his life had always been spent in slumber. Scraps of a dream that was too realistic to be just a vision were still flashing before my eyes. He remembered even the taste in his mouth, the ache in his weary muscles and the fatigue he felt there in his sleep. But what struck him most was his own body. It suddenly seemed too awake, too ready to move. Iron looked at his hands, which were trembling slightly, and realized his body had changed. It was as if it demanded movement, so much energy that he couldn't sit still. Not knowing what to do about it, he called for a servant, hoping to make some sense of his sensations. When the servant entered the room, Iron hesitated, not knowing how to explain his strange state. He tried to find the words, but met only a puzzled look, clearly expecting a coherent answer. Iron, stammering, finally squeezed out that he wanted to pick up the sword, surprised at the words himself. The servant looked at him with a long pause, clearly not knowing how to respond to such an unexpected request. Suddenly his face contorted with shock, and he exclaimed, not believing what he had heard, as if it were a ridiculous joke. Meanwhile, in Ferrera's training room, tension was simmering, people were whispering, perplexed by what was happening. One of the guards, not believing his eyes, asked his partner if he could see it, but received only a stunned confirmation. The group of observers were surprised to admit that the rumors were true. No one had expected such a turn. Iron paced the hall confidently, his footsteps sounding deafening, as if emphasizing the importance of the moment. Everyone froze, realizing the unbelievable. The one who was called the Lazy Lord had come to the training hall for the first time. The guards were perplexed, for normally he was hard to even see, but now he had come here himself. Someone whispered stunned, wondering if it was possible that he had come to train, but the others just couldn't believe it. Iron stopped in front of the weapons rack, as if something inside him told him where to look. One observer noted that wooden swords varied in type, weight, and length. The hall master offered to wait to bring someone more knowledgeable in the matter, but Iron declined. He scrutinized the stand, studying the swords, and seemed to already know which one to choose. Without hesitation, he reached out, grasped the sword firmly, and confidently declared that he would take this particular one. One of the guards couldn't believe what was happening and decided to pinch himself to make sure he was awake. His partner grudgingly exclaimed that at least now one could definitely not doubt reality. Meanwhile, Iron clenched his sword tightly in his hands and tensed up and made the first confident leap. The guards froze, not expecting such determination from him, and one of them exhaled in surprise. The servant watching this swallowed, feeling something unpredictable begin to happen right before his eyes. Iron clutched his sword tightly, but his hands trembled as if his body was not yet accustomed to the sensation. He was breathing heavily, trying to gather his thoughts, but his breath was hitching from the unaccustomed exertion. With a sharp motion, he swung his sword, but the blow was awkward, causing the weapon to slip. Iron gritted his teeth, tensing his muscles, but the weakness in his arms prevented him from holding the sword properly. The blade hit the floor with a thud, leaving behind a noisy but completely clumsy trail. Iron gritted his teeth, straining his arms, but they continued to shake from the strain and the unaccustomed exertion. The two watchers watched him in silence until one admitted that he had expected something like this. The other confirmed with a slight chuckle that such a lazy man simply couldn't wield a sword. They discussed his strange decision to train, for he had never shown any interest in martial arts before. Iron remembered that he had been humiliated in front of everyone a month ago, and now it was clear that thought hadn't let him go all this time. One of the watchers lazily asked how long Irene would last, to which he received a sneering reply, 3 days, no more. Someone suggested with a smirk that he would give up even faster, perhaps as soon as 30 minutes. Iron gritted his teeth as he heard the conversation behind him, but he didn't allow himself to be distracted, only gripping his sword tighter. The servant respectfully suggested that he find him a good instructor and start training from tomorrow. But Iron, breathing heavily, struggled to hold the sword, feeling not only his arms ache, but his entire body. Iron put all his strength into another swing, but his body once again failed to obey him. His steps became uncertain, his legs shook, and then he lost his balance. Before he had time to realize what was happening, he collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily. Lying on his back, he greedily gulped for air, feeling exhaustion throughout his body. And yet, despite the fatigue, a strange sense of calm suddenly settled inside. Iron struggled to rise, leaning on his sword, and prepared to move again. Every step he took, every movement of his sword seemed to bring him closer to what he had seen in his dream. With each swing, he felt the heaviness pressing on his heart gradually fade away. All the painful memories and bitterness that tormented him seemed to dissolve into thin air. The more he moved, the more relieved he felt, and so he couldn't stop. Iron was breathing heavily, his gaze was determined, but fatigue was already making itself felt. Someone called out to him, hurriedly approaching him, and then insisted that enough was enough for today. The servant anxiously explained that it was already starting to get dark, but Iron could hardly understand his words. He tried to respond, but his legs failed and his body staggered, causing him to lose his balance. Before fully settling to the ground, a servant picked him up, asking if he was all right. Iron struggled to open his eyes, realizing that he had really overdone it today. Looking up at the dark sky, he marveled at how quickly the time had flown by while he was absorbed in his training. The servant, supporting him, remarked reprovingly that he had called out to him long ago, but Iron had not responded. He then advised practicing with more restraint so as not to drive himself to exhaustion next time. Irene, breathing heavily, thought he didn't want to repeat this day, but he was going to continue anyway. Iron felt every muscle in his body whimper with fatigue, questioning his sanity. Lying in bed, he was sure that because of the pain, he wouldn't be able to sleep well that night. However, after only a few minutes, his body gave up and he fell into a deep sleep. A few days passed, the castle filled with the morning sounds of birds heralding a new day. Iron ate quietly, taking a bite out of his breakfast, preparing for another day. Iron ate his breakfast greedily, focusing on the day ahead. The servant watching him asked in surprise if he planned to train again. Irene himself realized that since that day, the strange dream had kept him awake. He realized that while he was training, his mind was clearing and his body was demanding to continue. Clutching his glass, Iron resolutely ordered more food to be brought to him, preparing for another training session. Near the training room, excitement was simmering, for something important was expected today. One of the guards smugly declared that he would win the argument anyway. Another, turning to the new soldier, asked who he thought was the favorite. Suddenly their attention was caught by an old man politely asking for directions to the hall. When he was stopped, He introduced himself as a traveling knight wanting to take a look at local training. The old man confidently stated that he had a permit, rummaging through his belongings for the document. The guards, deciding not to bother looking for him, offered to go with them, as their path matched. As they approached the massive doors of the hall, one of the guards eagerly offered to see who had won the argument. Suddenly someone froze in shock, their eyes widening at the unexpected discovery. Iron stood on the training ground, making everyone marvel that he was actually still practicing for the 4th day in a row. One of the guards exclaimed joyfully that he had won, glowing with happiness, while his partner sighed heavily. Reluctantly, the loser tossed the bag of coins into the hands of the winner, who thanked him with a satisfied smile. Someone remarked in surprise that Iron was actually practicing for the 4th day in a row, to which another replied that it was expected after the humiliation from Viscount Geron's son. The irritated guard blurted out that he should have been told earlier, but all he heard in response was that no one would give out such information. Noticing the tense atmosphere, the old man only silently observed the situation, and the recruit tried to justify himself, but his words hung in the air. Iron continued to train, showing unexpected tenacity, though his swordsmanship still left much to be desired. The observer noted that the young lord had little control over his breathing and his muscles could not support the weight of the weapon. The old man wondered about Iron's motives, assuming he was only training because of wounded pride. He confidently decided that the young man would give up sooner or later, but a sudden gust of wind made him freeze. The guards and the old man raised their heads in surprise, wondering why the wind had suddenly increased at this very moment. One of the guards shrieked in surprise, watching in horror as the feather spun in the air. Iron raised his head, feeling the powerful gust of wind that swept over the courtyard. High in the sky, cutting through the clouds, a creature floated majestically, causing everyone to freeze in amazement. Cyril Ferreira stood nearby, enveloped in a whirlwind, and a huge griffin descended beside her. Old chronicles described this creature as a mythical beast with steel skin, not existing in reality. The guards recoiled, their faces contorted in fear as a resounding thump sounded in front of them. A figure in luxurious robes stepped smoothly onto the ground, her gait confident and relaxed. The griffin landed behind, its massive body trembling from the powerful landing, causing the onlookers to tremble. Kirill touched the creature's thick fur, as if confirming her power over this incredible creature. A mysterious gleam flashed in the griffin's eyes, and at this moment, it seemed that he was truly alive. Cyril pointed her finger confidently at the guard, her voice sounding demanding and commanding. The guard flinched, straightening up quickly, and her penetrating gaze made him freeze in place. Turning to the others, she sharply ordered the other 2 guards to pay attention to her as well. The wise elder with a good-natured smile introduced himself as a wandering knight who happened to drop by the training hall. Looking down at the frightened guards from above, Kirill reproachfully reminded them of their past lapses in service. The guard, smiling strangely, tried to justify himself by explaining that they had just changed from their day's post. Kirill looked at him intently and turned her head to clarify if he really thought her words were wrong. The guard hastily mewed, but Kirill abruptly cut him off, saying that instead of training, they were only chatting. Iron, out of breath, shifted his gaze to what was happening and asked perplexedly what had happened here. Kirill, without saying a word, stared coldly forward, her gaze expressing unwavering severity. Cyril sighed heavily, her gaze intense and her expression stern. She ordered an immediate stop to this madness, but Iron, confused, only interjected what exactly. He fell silent, his thoughts darting about, and a tense silence hung in the air. Suddenly the stranger turned around slowly and Kirill was instantly wary, her eyes widening. Meanwhile, Iron gripped the hilt of his sword, his fingers trembling with tension and his grip growing tighter. Kirill swung her hand furiously, demanding an answer as to what Iron had been doing all these years. She noted with disdain that he had suddenly decided to take up the sword, but that wouldn't change anything. Her gaze was full of disappointment when she pointed out that even the new recruits already outnumbered him. The griffin beside her bowed her head slightly, and Kirill continued to insist if it had anything to do with past events. Meanwhile, someone important was approaching, and the soldiers froze as they recognized the woman who appeared. The woman gently but firmly told Cyril to leave her brother alone and come over to her. Kirill clenched her fists, but not wanting to cross her, she restrained her emotions and silently obeyed. The soldiers observing the scene straightened up as the woman turned to greet everyone. Her voice was calm but filled with authority, and her smile remained unfailingly warm. Lastly, she advised Iron not to overdo it, to which he nodded hastily. The woman and Kirill walked quietly out of the hall, leaving a tense silence behind them. The soldiers exhaled with relief, realizing that the unpleasant conversation was over for them. But a sudden sharp cry from the griffin made them cringe and flinch in fright. The old man watched with a slight smile as he pondered the identity of Kirill. He felt like a hurricane had just blown through, but he decided not to dwell on it. The young man continued to train with focus, not distracted by what was going on around him. Measured footsteps echoed in the dark hallway, breaking the silence of the night. A graceful foot treads softly on the floor, approaching the target with confidence. The servant discreetly informed Cyril that the young master was now resting. But she only coldly replied that she had important things to talk about. The servant paused silently, hesitant to object, but his tension was noticeable. Cyril glared and threw out a burst of energy with force, unleashing it on her interlocutor. The man froze, his body trembling and his face contorted with sudden terror. He collapsed to the floor, breathing heavily, unable to control his fear. Cyril coldly warned that it was best not to tell anyone what had happened if he knew what was best for him. The servant slowly rose to his knees, breathing heavily, and hesitantly took a few steps. His face remained tense and his eyes reflected the fear and confusion of what had happened. Irene, lying in bed, noticed movement in the room and was distracted by the music playing around him. He cast a fleeting glance to the side, clearly sensing something, but not yet realizing what it was. On the floor at the servant's feet was a sealed envelope that looked as if someone had planted it on purpose. Irene unfolded the envelope in surprise, feeling the paper crunch in his fingers. Inside was a letter where the author apologized for his words after learning that he was overworking himself. Attached to the letter was a doll to help relax, with the hope that it would do some good. On the back, he found another message in which his mother offered to tell him if Cyril was causing him too much trouble. He looked at the toy thoughtfully, realizing that his mother and Cyril cared for him despite his long years of inactivity. Irene heard a knock on the door, and rising, he repeated the word breakfast in surprise, as if realizing its meaning anew. He stepped into the hallway, contemplating eating with his family today instead of alone. The servant watched him in amazement, realizing that Lord Irene had indeed changed. At the table, his mother suggested he try different dishes, and he nodded in agreement. Cyril got some advice too, but Irene was already absorbed in the family meal, trying new flavors. Irene, sitting at the table with his family, finally expressed his gratitude to his parents and sister for their care. He admitted that he couldn't say those words before, but now, apologizing, he added that he loved them. His father smiled softly, noting that there was no need to apologize, and suggested that he just enjoy the meal. Then, breaking the silence, he turned to his son, drawing his attention to an important conversation. He informed Irene that he had heard of his training, praising him but warning him against overexerting himself. Irene confidently assured his father that he wasn't overworking himself, insisting that he was fine. He remembered his dream, realizing that his current training was nothing compared to what he had seen. Meanwhile, the other nobles were discussing with interest how many days had passed since he had started his hard work. The answer was unexpected: approximately 2 weeks of continuous training, without a single skip. The people around him looked at Irene with disbelief, wondering if he had really changed or if he was about to give up. One of the nobles noticed an elderly man who had been frequenting the training hall lately. Another explained that the one had official authorization for surveillance, but no one knew why he needed it. The old man wondered to himself if it had been 10 days since he had started following Irene. At first he thought that the young man was only driven by pride and a sense of inferiority, but he turned out to be completely wrong. It amazed him how someone who had previously been called lazy could train without any sign of fatigue. The old man looked at Irene and marveled. He practiced with the tenacity of a blacksmith who had spent years forging steel. In his entire life, he had hardly ever met people with such an unyielding will, as if the young man had been steadily marching forward for decades. Even the greatest heroes take years to temper their spirit, but this guy was demonstrating similar things at the age of 15. If he continues to develop his skills and finds a mentor to help him reach his potential, what kind of great swordsman could he become? Irene didn't stop for a second, sword whistling through the air, and the watchers watched him with interest. An old man sitting nearby was watching the young man thoughtfully when a man approached him with a question. The stranger inquired if the young lad had a fencing mentor and heard that he did not yet. The old man nodded in response, and the man remembered that Baron Ferreira had promised to find a teacher for him soon. Irene trained with such tenacity that it would be a real loss if he was never taught properly. The man nodded thoughtfully and announced that Sir Orlan Jukran would be Irene's mentor. But the old man jumped up abruptly, shouting indignantly that this could not be allowed. He knew that this man was more into drinking than learning fencing. Remembering his violent antics, he couldn't allow such a man to train Irene. Determined to act immediately, he took a firm step towards his goal, impressing those around him with his determination. The old man was breathing heavily, resolutely insisting on seeing the Baron. The Baron, hearing the unexpected news, asked doubtfully if it was true. The old man firmly confirmed that everything said was true. The Baron pondered. trying to realize if his son really did have such potential. But there was still doubt in his gaze, as if he couldn't quite believe it. The majestic emblem of the Chrono Swordsman Academy towered above the letter of enrollment. This place was known as the most prestigious academy, accepting the best regardless of their background. Becoming her apprentice meant attaining a status higher than that of many aristocrats. The Baron pondered, realizing that it was hard to get in, but even harder to stay in. Could Iron really withstand such stiff competition? The Baron looked at his son in surprise, not expecting such a turn. He assured Iron that he would not force him and left the choice up to him. The young man just wanted to make sure he really had the opportunity to decide for himself. He asked for a few days to think things over, to which the Baron calmly agreed. Left alone in his room, Iron fell into deep thought. Iron stood in his room, gripped by doubt, wondering if he could handle it. His fingers clenched into a fist and thoughts of years of inactivity resounded in his head. Clutching the sheet, he felt a sudden sense of determination, realizing it wasn't just him. His gaze slid to the sky outside the window and he realized he wanted to do this for his family. He stepped resolutely into the study and, meeting the Baron's gaze, said quietly, "Father." Irene, determined, loudly declares his desire to try it. He bids his family farewell at the estate gate, hearing the whispers of the servants. His parents and Cyril wish him a safe journey as they watch him leave. Wagon wheels crackle on the road, birds soar into the sky, the journey begins. The servant remarks with a smile that this is Iron's first trip off the estate, and he confirms. The servant holds out a small bundle to Iron, handed from Kirill. Unfolding the cloth, he freezes when he sees the gleaming metallic symbol. Clutching the gift in her hand, Irene thanks her sister for this token of support. The windows of the wagon offer a view of the majestic walls, causing him to exhale admiringly. Finally, they arrive at the massive gates of the academy, where a crowd of people have already gathered. The servant offers to escort Iron to the entrance, but he turns to him with a hard stare. Hearing the refusal, the man freezes in surprise, not expecting such independence from his master. Irene says he's just a student now and should get used to being on his own. The servant barely holds back his tears, looking warmly at the young master who has taken an important step. Iron, without turning around, resolutely steps towards the academy gates, starting a new phase of her life. Iron, without stopping, continues to stride forward, with admonitions about his future accomplishments echoing behind him. A group of people had already gathered in front of the academy gates, among whom a young man of noble descent stood out. One of the knights announces that the person arriving is Lord Brett Lloyd, son of an earl from the kingdom of Guerra. The other knights respectfully bow their heads in deference to his noble lineage and invite him inside. The older knight frowns, noticing something unusual, and his face reflects clear surprise. Iron introduces himself, stating that he has come on the recommendation of a traveling knight named Bran Somerville. The knight standing in front of the gate respectfully refers to Iron as the heir to the Ferreira family. Another guard recalls Bran's exploits with admiration, stating that his recommendation guarantees success. Iron is shown the way to the audience, wishing him luck, and he heads forward, leaving the guards behind. One of the knights thoughtfully remarks that it is strange to see Bran writing references, and then recognizes Iron. Iron strides forward confidently, unaware of the mocking voices behind him. One of the knights, looking at him, notices that he looks weaker than expected outwardly. The other only shrugs, assuming they'll all soon find out what he's capable of. The door to the auditorium opens with a loud creak, and Irene takes a deep breath before entering. Inside, he is met with many surprised looks, and the silence is broken by someone's suppressed exclamation. Iron feels the cold, hard stares of the people around him. He forces himself to remain calm, repeating the thought over and over again. Footsteps are heard in front, and his attention turns to a man stepping out to the gathered crowd. The one loudly introduces himself as Instructor Ahmed and declares that he will train them. Iron is shocked. He's met this man before and didn't expect to see him here at all. The instructor evaluates those gathered and notices some really promising individuals among them. The girl who stands out among all of them is said to be even more talented than her older brother. One of the young men is taken aback by her presence and doesn't understand why she would even be in training. He clenched his teeth in annoyance, realizing that her involvement was ruining his chances of being the best. Meanwhile, the instructor announces that they are all just preliminary students for now, and the training will be extremely difficult. The instructor explains that only after successfully passing 2 exams will students be able to stay here for a year. With a smirk, he adds that an even more hellish ordeal awaits them afterward. He tells them to leave their things and go outside where he wants to show them something important. The group is presented with a training area designed to develop endurance. The instructor explains that although there are slopes, this place will be a regular running track for them. The coach gives the signal to start with fierce energy, and the cadets, startled, rush forward. One of the runners offers to speed up with a gambling smile, while someone nearby shudders fearfully. The crowd of cadets rushes around the track, their footsteps creating a deafening buzz, while the coach encourages them approvingly. Some are already panting, their faces contorted with exertion, but the two persevere, running side by side, not giving up. In the distance, one of the cadets keeps his cool, deciding to watch everyone from the tail of the group. Rainer turns his head with ease and laughs as if it's just a game to him. Leon struggles to stay on his feet, breathing heavily, while someone's voice in his head mockingly reminds him of his nickname. There's panic in Leon's eyes, he can't go on any longer, and the others are getting farther and farther ahead. The coach rushes forward with a group of cadets behind him, but Leon stays behind, panting with exhaustion. The coach silently glances back, his face remaining stern, but there is a look of contemplation in his eyes. Leon leaned on her knees with trembling hands, watching the other runners get farther and farther away. Heavy footsteps sound nearby, and he flinches, realizing that someone has approached him. Rainer turns his head sharply, his gaze tense, as if he hadn't expected to see such a thing. An order to rise sounds in Leon's head, and he grits his teeth and rushes forward without looking back. The coach watches with a predatory smile, confident that this is just the beginning of the challenge. The image of a man who had survived unimaginable ordeals and was not broken by suffering came before Leon's eyes. Clenching her fists, Leon decides that she wants to be just as strong, to become his equal. Determination flashes in his gaze, he realizes he has to move forward for this. With a loud jerk, Leon rushes in pursuit, his body burning with fatigue, but he doesn't give up. The watcher is surprised, he was sure Leon would break soon, but he's still holding on. The watcher suddenly flinches, his expression changing as he notices something strange. Darkness envelopes Leon and a sharp pain pierces his body, making him cough up blood. Breathing convulsively, Leon tries with his last strength to stay on his feet, but his body shakes. The coach and cadets notice him losing his balance and their eyes widen with shock. In the next instant, someone rushes forward swiftly, leaving only a trail of running behind them. The man in the stands reacts instantly, catching Leon at the last moment before he falls. The coach runs up to the spot. In the distance the cadets continue to run, but some begin to stop. With a heavy sigh, the man who saved him realizes that Leon has driven himself to the point of complete exhaustion. Looking at the young man lying before him, he finds him unusually curious and strangely persistent. Suddenly, Leon's eyes go wide and his consciousness is brought back to reality. Irene slowly opens his eyes and sits up on the bed, looking around confused, not realizing where he is. At that moment, someone says that he's finally awake, and Irene turns his head in surprise. Rune Tarhal assures him with a smile that there is nothing to worry about, introducing himself as the one responsible for the recovery. Irene thanks him, but Rune states with an important look that he wouldn't have recovered so quickly without him. Laughing, Rune remarks that it looks like they'll be seeing each other a lot, then teases Irene. Rune nonchalantly holds out the scroll to Irene as if it were something insignificant, but he immediately becomes alarmed. Irene unfolds the document, and Rune explains that it's only a preliminary ranking, not affecting final grading. Iron's eyes widen when he sees his name at the very bottom of the list, in the 400th spot. Rune shrugs, noting that a high rating is nice and a low rating gives you a chance to work harder. With a smile, he adds that things will change in a year, but is perplexed as to why Irene looks so stunned. Irene calmly accepts the news, much to the surprise of Rune watching him, who had expected a different reaction. Rune urges him on sharply, stating that he shouldn't be lazy on his first day, forcing him to hurry. In the spacious room, the instructor greets the cadets and hopes they are well rested before the training begins. Karaka notes with a smile that everyone looks in great shape and is happy to introduce himself to them as their mentor. He announces the schedule of the day, explaining that the cadets will follow this routine unless there is a change. The instructor announces that cadets will have free time to practice after completing the day's schedule. Irene enthuses, excited about the opportunity to finally take up fencing and improve her skills. However, the mentor raises his finger sharply, hinting that there is an important clarification. In a loud voice, he declares that any training with weapons is strictly forbidden, causing Irene to gasp in shock. Night is slowly falling over the academy, and its windows glow dimly in the thickening darkness. A group of cadets stride confidently down the stone walkway, heading towards the massive doors of the building. One of them complained to Lloyd that the theory class was too boring after the tedious training. Rainer replied with a chuckle that the man simply didn't understand half of what he said, causing an indignant reaction. Once inside, the cadets looked around in surprise, amazed at the size of the training room. In the spacious room, someone was lifting weights, someone was doing push-ups, and there was a hum of voices in the air. On the first day, training is in full swing and it seems that no one intends to relax. Rainer, looking around, notices that many are working hard, but is sure that many will drop out over time. There is a tense sound in the hall. Someone is lifting an impressive barbell, about to demonstrate strength. With a loud exhale, the cadet makes an upward jerk, tensing his muscles and concentrating fully on the movement. An impressive sight opens up to the eyes of others. The cadet confidently holds a huge weight above her head. Rainer looks at Ilya Lindsay, mentally repeating her name and feeling a strange excitement. The rumors about her clearly didn't convey the whole truth, even watching her is already overwhelming. He senses that Ilya is on a whole other level that he can't even reach. The difference between them seems insurmountable, and he can't even experience envy, only the realization of his own weakness. One of the cadets is surprised to notice that Ilya is younger than he is, yet has incredible physical fitness. Someone is surprised to notice that even lazy Lord Iron is now actively training. The other cadets mockingly discuss that it's like he's a different person after yesterday. Irene struggles to lift the barbell, but his feeble stance only elicits laughter from the onlookers. Ilya, silently wiping the sweat from her face, stares indifferently at everything that is happening, showing no emotion. Rainer indifferently tells him not to waste time and to leave, to which he receives a short reply. Judith glances at Rainer as he passes by, her mind clearly on something important. Rainer realizes that in front of him is the same commoner Judith who came in second place after him. He admits that she probably had to make a huge effort to make it this far. Judith is breathing hard after her workout, but determination flashes in her eyes that won't let her give up. With fury, she thinks she won't let Rainer take the top spot away from her again. Judith yells in annoyance, demanding that Rainer stop staring at her during practice. Rainer, dumbfounded by this outburst, hesitantly asks if she's really addressing him. Judith replies sharply that of course she is talking to him specifically, and tells him to leave so as not to distract her. The other cadets are outraged, reminding them that Rainer is the son of a noble family, and demand that Judith apologize. She brushes it off by squirming, stating that they all had the same food, but someone's mouth clearly stinks. Judith abruptly interrupts the conversation, demanding that everyone be quiet for at least a second. Rainer looks at her in surprise, clearly not understanding what such a sudden statement has to do with anything. Suddenly Judith rushes forward, and Rainer turns stunned, trying to comprehend what is happening. They both freeze, realizing that someone has interfered, drawing everyone's attention. Ilya, continuing her workout, calmly offers something, turning to Iron, who is still struggling with the barbell. Ilya calmly turns to Iron, asking if she can speak to him privately. Irene, still holding the barbell, interjects in confusion, not realizing what he's talking about. Judith, noticing this, tenses up, her expression changing and worry flickering in her eyes. Ilya stands silently in front of Iron, as if contemplating where to begin the conversation. Leaning closer, she whispers something quietly to him, and Irene listens with a surprised expression. The people around them watch in amazement, clearly stunned by the sudden situation. Irene hastily gets up from the bench, and Ilya, wasting no time, confidently turns around and walks away. She calmly walks into the room without looking back, as if she's completely sure of her decision. The door slams shut behind her with a loud thud, leaving Iron alone with a choice. He stands silent, his face impassive, but there is an undercurrent of tension in his eyes. Iron furtively casts a sidelong glance, his face remaining calm, but inside he is clearly thinking. Everyone in the room is tensely watching him, and someone is desperately trying to get his attention. Rainer irritably admits that he still couldn't hear exactly what Ilya said to Iron. Judith abruptly interrupts the conversation, throwing something to the side and clearly not intending to back down. Iron, on the other hand, ignoring all this noise, calmly continues her training. Judith sharply calls out to Iron, clearly irritated by his indifference to what's going on. Irene freezes for a moment, still holding the barbell, then looks up bewildered. Judith demands that he show a modicum of respect and respond when spoken to. As he gets closer, she declares that she's not interested in him and demands to be told the truth immediately. Iron looks at her confused, not sure what exactly she wants an answer about. Judith stares intently at Iron, demanding that he tell her exactly what Ilya told him. Irene calmly replies that she was just explaining to him the proper stance and use of the exercise equipment. Judith exclaimed in bewilderment, not believing that Ilya had approached him for such a small thing. She asks suspiciously if she and Ilya know each other beforehand or if there is something between them. Then grinning, Judith advises Irene to relax, because from the outside it might seem like she's intimidating him. Irene notes to herself that Judith is being too pushy, but decides to just keep practicing. Remembering Ilya's advice, he tries to repeat the movements as she taught him. Rainer turns to him suddenly, wondering what exactly he was talking to Ilya about. A month passes and the same strict discipline reigns in the hall, with no change. The cadets discuss that the training is repeated over and over again, and they are still not allowed to use swords. Rainer watches silently, his expression remaining impenetrable, but something is clearly brewing inside. Ilya calmly corrects Iron, indicating that he should keep his back straight. She advises him to breathe steady as he struggles to lift his weight, straining every muscle. Rainer does a warm-up, mentally noting that there's no point in him worrying about the two of them. He admits that he can never objectively beat Ilya, because she is undeniably the best this year. Rainer stares blankly at Iron, realizing that he poses no threat to him. He's sure that Iron got here by unfair means and doesn't deserve a place in the academy. There is no doubt in his mind, a man who has never trained can't reach his level. Even if Iron is now inspired by Ilya's support and the ridicule of those around him, it won't last long. Rainer heads determinedly towards the treadmill, knowing firmly that his main goal is second place. Rainer steps onto the treadmill with confidence, his face focused and his thoughts fully engaged in his workout. Judith had already started warming up, casting a quick glance to the side when she noticed Rainer's appearance. Someone remarks in surprise that she always arrives early to get ready to run. Rainer clenched his teeth, mentally acknowledging her persistence but not allowing himself to be distracted. Without further ado, he announces the start of the run, much to the surprise of the other cadets. Rainer gives a clear direction: those who have a hard time can run slowly, but those who are able must give their best. With a serious look, he adds that they should run as if their lives depended on it. 3 months pass, and the cadets' footsteps on the training ground sound more confident. Instructors note that, as expected, many did not make it, but those who remained were more than in previous years. Meanwhile, Judith continues to train hard, and Rainer and a group of cadets are racing down the track, not slowing down. The instructor starts to speak with a slight smile, but misfires as if he was about to call someone lazy. Watching Iron, he realizes that such a nickname doesn't fit him now. Irene continues his workout, diligently lifting dumbbells, confirming that his former image no longer makes sense. An announcement sounds in the academy hall, drawing the attention of all the cadets. It's time for the midterm, and Irene listens with a serious look, realizing the importance of the moment. The instructor claps his hands together, getting the cadets' attention before beginning an important announcement. He explains that their test is to complete a special course in the allotted time. Judith reacts with disbelief at the task, and concerned whispers echo around her. The instructor explains that the test consists of exercises they are accustomed to, such as running and swimming. He then adds that the head of the academy will personally reward the top 5, causing Rainer to swallow nervously. The instructor announces that the exam will take place in 10 days, and the cadets will have no classes until then. One of the students asks Rainer if he can handle it, but gets a confident answer that he shouldn't be doubted. Rainer mentally analyzes the situation, realizing that Ilya, Judith, and a few others are among the strongest. He is convinced that with his level of preparation he is practically guaranteed a place in the top 5. However, as he watches the swiftly running Iron, he can't get rid of the disturbing feeling. The academy building towers over the training area, where the cadets continue their intensified training. Judith, with a tense face, clutches the barbell shaft and, straining her muscles, lifts the heavy weight. She proudly celebrates her new record and decides that she's had enough training for the day. But suddenly her body gives out with fatigue, and she struggles to hold back a bout of nausea after the grueling exertion. Turning around, Judith notices something unexpected and opens her eyes wide with surprise. Irene, panting, falls to her knees, barely keeping herself from being completely exhausted. Judith watches him and is amazed as he pushes himself to the limit once again. She remembers what he was like in the beginning and can't believe how much stronger he's gotten. Clenching her fists, she begins to question, does she have less willpower than the former slacker? With a loud shout, she takes up the barbell again, determined not to give in to her persistence. One instructor wonders how many students will make it to the end of the challenge this year. Another instructor suggests that the number will be around 30, but his remark is met with skepticism. Suddenly, the head of the academy appears and explains that he preferred to see everything himself rather than listen to rumors. He welcomes the new assistant instructor, who respectfully acknowledges his background and expresses the honor of getting to know him. With curiosity, the head of the academy asks how old he is, causing his interlocutor to squeeze out an awkward answer in confusion. The head of the academy smiles, stating that he doesn't like flattery, but still doubles the instructor's salary. Walking around the training yard, he notes that the atmosphere at the academy has changed significantly this year. The instructor embarrassedly replies that he gets too much credit, but the head of the academy frowns thoughtfully. Watching the practice, He recalls that the girl at the barbell is a second-generation fencing master. He remarks bitterly that society may have forced her down this path and hopes she finds herself. The head of the academy notices the girl and clarifies if this is the student he was told about earlier. The instructor confirms his hunch and admits that he tried to warn her, but to no avail. The head of the academy decides to stop her, considering it unacceptable to lose such a talented student. The instructor is sure the girl will listen when she recognizes who is standing in front of her. The girl, seeing the master, freezes in amazement, not realizing what is happening. The instructor says with a smile that the girl is quite stubborn and will only stop for a good reason. The head of the academy, hearing this, suddenly wonders where Irene Ferreira is. A rumble is heard in the training room, something heavy falls and makes a ringing sound. The other instructor, seeing this, is surprised and asks how long all this has been going on. He is told that Irene has been practicing non-stop for over 30 minutes now, continuing to lift weights. The head of the academy turns to the others and tells them not to interfere with what's going on. One of the instructors asks in surprise if it's really not worth stopping Irene. The head of the academy confirms that there is no need to interfere with him unless he gives up on his own. Irene maintains full control of her body despite her exhaustion. Finally, his strength runs out and he collapses to the ground, sighing heavily. Irene lies on the bed, sighing heavily, his body covered in bandages and abrasions. He stares at the ceiling, reflecting on how strangely the last few days have changed. Those who used to ridicule and ignore him have now begun to notice his accomplishments. He wonders why Ilya is helping him, since she doesn't seem like someone who does it out of pity. Sighing, Irene decides to stop filling her head with these thoughts and just rest. Irene opens his eyes, looking around in confusion, not realizing where he is. Heavy red cloths flutter in front of him, and a cloaked figure can be seen in the distance. He snuggles into the soft fabric, realizing it's not a motherly embrace, but the warmth still feels familiar. The thought flashes through his mind that it would be nice to stay here longer, enjoying this peace. But a sudden bright flash illuminates the space, and someone's silhouette appears in front of him, causing him to be shocked. The heavy cloak soared into the air, as if obeying the impulse of an invisible force. An imposing figure appears before Irene, surrounded by a swirl of cloth and light. He freezes in amazement, looking at the tall figure exuding incredible power. His hand involuntarily reaches forward, clutching the edge of that cloak as if searching for support. But in the next instant, the cloak slips from his fingers, and Irene takes a step back, shocked at what's happening. Irene gently clutched the fabric of the cloak as if clinging to something important. He smiles softly and looks forward, mouthing words of thanks. Slowly stepping away, he disappears among the fluttering red cloths. Suddenly everything around him goes dark and he realizes it's time to go back. In the next second, he lifts himself up sharply on the bed, feeling reality take hold of him again. Irene walks outside, leaving a slight swirl behind him as if his body is still filled with heat. His footsteps sound confident, but the world around him seems especially bright after a long time in isolation. The cadets gathered nearby are whispering, looking at his clothes and wondering if he has spent the whole night without sleep. One of them sighs in frustration, realizing that now he won't have an easy victory over his exhausted opponent. Lloyd looks at Judith, noting that she too is visibly exhausted, though not giving up. Lloyd grins, confident that if he doesn't let his guard down, he'll take second place. Irene stands back, head lowered in concentration as Ilya glimpses Ilya turning in his direction. The instructor announces that there are 5 minutes left before the exam begins and will explain the rules one last time. He points to a map, explaining that the course consists of 4 stages, each with an instructor. Recalling that the grade is absolute, he urges the cadets not to think about their opponents, but to show how they have improved. Ilya gives the command sharply, and all the participants rush to perform the first test. The cadets begin the barbell bench press, Ilya lifting the weight the fastest. Lloyd tenses, recognizing that even if he tried his best, he couldn't match her. But he's confident that barring Ilya, he still has a chance. Suddenly something surprises him, and he peers suspiciously into the scene. Lloyd opens his eyes wide, something hits him hard, like a flash of insight. Someone's arms are lifting the barbell with tension, muscles trembling from the effort. The instructor watches closely as someone makes a decisive leap. Irene lifts the heavy weight with a shout, pushing her own limits. Lloyd looks at him irritably, perplexed as to whether he's about to completely exhaust himself. Ilya calmly completes the first stage of the challenge, while Lloyd tries his best to catch up with her. Lloyd can't believe his eyes, her speed seems impossible to him. Suddenly the announcement sounds that Irene has also finished the first stage. Irene breathes heavily, shaking her arms tiredly, but continues to move forward. The crowd is perplexed, discussing what has happened, while Irene himself tries to ignore it. Irene continues the competition despite the taunts and moves on to the second stage, the baller jump. Concentrating, he pushes himself off the ground and deftly jumps up, feeling a strange burning sensation in his body. Each step comes easier to him than before, and he suddenly realizes that he no longer feels the limit of his abilities. An inner voice doubts, won't he lose his rhythm if he moves too fast? But Irene brushes aside his fears, his gaze blazing with determination. He must speed up even more. The instructor announces that Irene has successfully completed the second phase of the test, not hiding the surprise in his voice. Those around him look on in bewilderment, not believing that he actually managed it so quickly. Lloyd, seeing what was happening, clenched his teeth and tensed his muscles, realizing he needed to put in even more effort. Judith, shouting a battle cry, lifts the barbell with incredible speed, unwilling to give in to this competition. The senior observer looks at the participants with a slight smile, assessing their accomplishments with obvious interest. Irene, breathing heavily, runs down the track, trying to keep up the pace during the third leg of the challenge. In front, Ilya rushes forward at an incredible speed, and Irene, not wanting to fall behind, speeds up. A strong gust of air rushes past him, and he is surprised to realize that his body moves differently than it did before. Ilya casts a brief glance back and notices that Irene is not only keeping up, but picking up the pace. Irene, breathing heavily, realizes that this feeling is strange, but his body keeps moving forward. Irene gasped with exhaustion, but the only question in her mind was, what was that feeling? Clenching his fists, he takes a deep breath, exhales and focuses, his gaze becoming determined. The thought keeps him on his toes. He wants something, but he can't quite figure out what it is. Ilya rushes forward, leaving clouds of dust behind her, and Irene rushes after her, quickening her pace. He senses something strange, looking forward with wonder, as if he doesn't understand what's going on. Judith rushes forward with incredible speed, leaving a swirl of dust behind her and rushing towards her target. Irene looks at her in surprise, calling out her name, not believing what's happening. Judith tensely accelerates, firmly convinced that she will never let herself lose. But her legs can't take the strain, and a sudden sharp pain makes her scream. Collapsing to the ground, she thinks in despair about everything she's been through to get to this point. Judith sat on her knees as mocking voices around her discussed her admission to the academy. Someone scornfully said that people like her are everywhere and she's only deluded about her powers. Her fingers clenched into a fist, nails digging into her skin, reflecting tension and hidden rage. Doubt flashed through her mind for a moment. Had she overestimated herself by deciding to take this path? But then her determination flared up stronger than before. She would not let anyone outdo her, ever. Judith's jaws clenched, determination burning in her gaze. She wasn't going to lose. With a powerful leap, she pushed herself off the ground, rushing forward as if she didn't know fatigue. The fourth stage, the long-distance swim, began as she entered the water with a loud splash. Surfacing, Judith drew in air frantically, desperately trying to maintain her speed. But suddenly her eyes widened with surprise. Something had gone wrong. A sharp pain pierced Judith's leg, causing her to shriek involuntarily and lose her rhythm. Her eyes widened with panic. Why now, when she was so close to the finish line? She tried to move forward, but her body was no longer obeying her, causing her to lose speed. With a loud splash, she collapsed into the water, her strength leaving her helpless. In the back of her mind, Judith realized this was her limit. She had gone too far. The pain in his leg throbbed with every movement, and the thought of inevitable defeat pervaded his mind. The exhausted body desperately demanded mercy, but the fight continued even if there was no chance of victory. Anger and frustration filled her heart, and tears mixed with the water, hiding her despair. Judith's strength finally left her, and her body began to sink slowly into darkness. Silence enveloped her, her thoughts fading, and all that was left was fatigue pulling at the very bottom. Judith floated helplessly on the water, barely keeping her head above the surface, her body completely exhausted. Irene, breathing heavily, scooted toward her, desperately grabbing her shoulder, trying to keep afloat. Judith's consciousness was on edge, her eyes blurred and her breathing became more and more intermittent. Irene, struggling to hold her, gave a sharp tug, and their bodies went underwater again with a loud splash. Judith pulled herself up, blinking against the spray, and Irene, breathing hard, stared at her stunned, puzzled as to what he was even doing. Judith, struggling to keep her head above water, exhaled a curse, and Irene said confidently that the shore was near. They climbed out of the water with vigor, Irene breathing heavily on his knees and Judith lying exhaustedly beside him. He leaned over her anxiously, trying to discern her condition, and in the distance an instructor was already running toward them. Irene rose abruptly to his feet, deciding to hand Judith over to safe hands while the rest of the party continued to run. The instructor loudly ordered to hurry up, and Iron, without wasting a second, tore off his seat and rushed forward. Judith could hardly breathe as she lay on the ground, her body shaking with fatigue and her eyes blurring. Through her blurred vision, she saw someone ahead of her keep moving, leaving her behind. One of the participants knelt down, his fingers digging into the ground, drops of water dripping off his hands. He bitterly admitted his defeat, clenching his fists, for he had put all his strength into this race. But the instructor coldly reminded him that it was too early to be discouraged, and the contestant looked up at him with a look full of doubt. The instructor announced that the second part of the test was ahead and advised not to give up, because the requirements were lower than in the first stage. One of the participants resolutely declared that he would definitely do well next time and ran with the others to the training area. Instructors exchanged feedback, noting that more participants took the test this year than in the past. One of them then singled out with a smile the most unexpected contender, a young man who had taken the penultimate place among those who had passed. Another cadet watched him from the side with a mocking smirk, wondering why he was trying to look like a good guy during the exam. One of the cadets, pleased with his success, remarked that he had placed fifth thanks to someone. His comrade was surprised at this result, but after a brief argument recognized his friend's achievement and congratulated him. A group of cadets were happily discussing their successes, and one of them saluted his mentor, believing it was to his credit. Another student congratulated his comrade on his second place, saying that he always believed he would win. However, he only looked away silently, remembering how during the exam, one participant had shown a level he couldn't come close to. Lloyd reflected gloomily that, had Judith not exhausted herself, he would have taken fourth place. He conceded defeat, realizing that his loss was flawless. The next morning, Iron was out jogging again, determinedly practicing his skills. His breathing was heavy, he was barely on his feet after a grueling workout. Suddenly someone came up to him and asked him why he did it. Iron turned around abruptly, seeing Ilya approaching him with a serious expression on her face. He questioned confusedly, not sure what she was talking about. However, Ilya didn't back down, confidently stating that he knew exactly what she meant. She stared at him intently, waiting for an answer before clarifying, "This is about saving Judith, isn't it?" Iron froze for a moment, then nodded, confirming her hunch. Riley stood in front of her, his face tense and a drop of sweat running down his temple. He opened his mouth trying to explain, but he stammered, lowered his gaze, and clenched his fists uncertainly. Finally, he took a deep breath and said that he just felt, it felt right. The girl frowned irritably, stating that even without him, the instructors would have intervened anyway. Her eyes flashed with anger. He could answer those who had humiliated him all this time. Riley's hand trembled, his fingers clenched slightly, but he remained silent, not knowing what to say. The girl looked directly at him and reminded him sharply that everyone called him Lazy Lord. A memory surfaced in Riley's mind. He felt stuck in a quagmire, seeing no way out. He lay wrapped in the blanket and admitted to himself that he hadn't even tried to get out. But at that moment his hand clenched. He didn't want to remain this pathetic self. Riley recalled how his family had reached out and pulled him from the abyss of despair. He realized that he only got out because of the help of others, and he couldn't ignore the drowning. Smiling, he calmly said that was why he had done that yesterday, and there was no difficulty in it. The girl looked at him silently, her expression impenetrable, as if she were considering something. Turning sharply, she reminded him that he had only taken up the sword last year, and Riley agreed. The girl coldly explained that physical training and fencing required different skills, but talent was more important. She declared that she wouldn't be helping him anymore, and Riley felt his throat go dry. Looking at him with a stern expression, she added that she hoped he wouldn't regret his choice. Riley was confused as to why she had even helped him up until this point, but there was no answer. After a short pause, the girl lifted the corner of her lips slightly and said just one word, "Well." The girl was walking away, throwing over her shoulder that she hated it when people judged others without knowing the truth. Riley stared at her in silence, his face impassive, but thoughts swarmed inside. The results of the interim assessment were announced in the hall in front of the audience, naming the number of successful candidates. The top 5 disciples stepped forward. They were to receive the reward personally from the sword master. Suddenly, one of those present frowned, realizing that someone had been forgotten, and another exclaimed, catching up. When Iron Ferreira's name was announced, Riley's head popped up sharply and someone nearby held their breath in surprise. Some students looked at him with tension as the mentor reasoned about the eternal race for success. He warned that in the pursuit of a goal, it is easy to forget one's surroundings and miss something important. However, Iron did otherwise, consciously putting himself in harm's way despite the possible consequences. Thanks to his decision, another student was saved, and the mentor warmly recognized the merit of this. Riley stepped to the podium, and his mentor's voice confirmed, His act was worthy of respect. The crowd was silent at first, but then one by one people started clapping, recognizing his merit. The applause grew stronger, some smiled and some looked doubtful, but respect was read in the audience. In the academy office, another student admitted that he had previously thought too narrowly and failed to see the obvious. The mentor replied calmly, but the young man admitted his mistake, choosing to learn from others rather than stubbornly follow his own path. The young man bowed, said a polite goodbye, and left the room, leaving behind a sense of determination. Mentor watched him thoughtfully, recognizing that he was aware of his weaknesses and striving to overcome them. He noted that despite his stubbornness and pride, the young man has exceptional leadership skills. If this year hadn't been so competitive, he might have ranked first among all students. Meanwhile, the girl firmly stated that she wanted personal fencing coaching as a reward. The mentor looked at the girl with a slight smile, recognizing that she was indeed brave. He gave her advice to not let others influence her decisions and to live her own life. Offering to practice in the spacious room, he asked if she would be more comfortable practicing here. The girl nodded quietly, agreeing that it was her choice, and thanked her mentor for the opportunity. When she left, he sighed heavily, relaxed and relieved that this was the last student. Mentor asked Iron if he wanted some sort of reward, even if it wasn't an item. He admitted that he was most interested in what Iron's answer to that question would be. Riley hesitated, not knowing how to phrase the request if he wanted to make up with someone. He hesitantly admitted that it sounded strange, but he had no one to discuss his apology with. Mentor smiled softly and assured him there was no need to apologize, thanking him for his honesty. Riley felt insecure, realizing that this was his first real experience with peers. Mentor noticed that someone had finally reached out to someone who had only been teased before. Riley thanked him for his advice, and the man admitted with a smile that he hadn't given instruction outside of fencing in a while. Mentor was surprised that Ilya was the one to make the first move toward reconciliation, finding it unexpected. He decided that the conversation about her could be ended and suggested that we move on to the main topic of conversation. The mentor admitted that he couldn't limit himself to a few words as an award, it wouldn't be fair. He firmly stated that he would teach Riley the ways of the sword and give valuable advice if he wished. Riley lowered his head confusedly, feeling embarrassed, for he didn't have a single question. He admitted that he only started training a month ago and doesn't know what he really wants. Mentor thought for a moment, then said Riley's name as if he was about to tell him something important. Riley struggled to choose his words, apologizing for his uncertainty but realizing how rare this opportunity was. Mentor clapped his hands together, saying that was all he could offer in response. He stood up abruptly and reminded Riley that a good swordsman should be confident, not apologetic. Riley's eyes went wide and then silently agreed, realizing the rightness of his words. The mentor decided to postpone the reward, allowing him to return later when he felt ready. The mentor asked with a smile if Riley was satisfied, and he bowed quickly, thanking him. Allowing him to leave, the mentor watched Riley calmly leave the building, striding confidently forward. He noted thoughtfully that this student was indeed unusual, there was something special about him. Although Riley doesn't know much about fencing, he doesn't look anxious, as if he already has a goal. An image appeared before his mind's eye, as if someone invisible were leading him down this path. The mentor thought about it and remembered that he had once had a similarly unusual student before. That girl had outstanding talent, and her confidence seemed boundless. Aside from her skill, she was unpredictable, her character remained a mystery even to him. Although she and Riley had something in common, their auras felt completely different. At this time, Riley was working out intently, doing push-ups and breathing heavily from the exertion. The girl looked at Riley in surprise, noticing that he was practicing again, and joked that he would be practicing every day now. Riley looked up and asked why she had come, and she hesitated, clearly unsure how to formulate an answer. Finally, she awkwardly admitted that she just wanted to say something, and he hastily thanked her. With a serious expression on her face, she promised that she would be sure to repay him for his help, but he replied that it was not necessary. After a brief pause, she softened and offered to take care of each other from now on. Riley looked at the girl in surprise when she suggested they take care of each other. She irritably reminded him that he always eats alone, so now they should eat lunch together. When he hesitated to answer, her gaze turned menacing, making him quickly agree. Satisfied, she announced that she would no longer bother him, referring to herself as his big sister. Riley sighed, thinking that she was 3 years younger than him, but the feeling next to her was nice. The girl hummed a strange song loudly, jokingly threatening to take the sword away from those who don't know her. The other students glanced over, one of them questioningly asking if she had changed since the incident. Riley smiled, trying not to argue, but some found her behavior a little intimidating. The other student looked at them thoughtfully, sensing that something seemed even stranger. His gaze stopped on Riley and Ilya, who were holding aloof, as if something important had happened between them. The instructor stepped forward and loudly caught the attention of everyone gathered, silencing them. He reminded them that fencing practice begins today and encouraged the students to be proud of their accomplishments. Everyone could choose a wooden sword to practice freely under the supervision of mentors. The girl swung her sword and noted with admiration that even with aggressive movements, balance was maintained. At this time, the two who were watching thought with chuckles that they had enhanced more than just her strength and stamina. The young man confidently swung the wooden sword, feeling that he could now feel the difference in technique. He calmly took a step forward, his gaze focused and his movements confident. The sound of footsteps echoed around the hall, creating a tense atmosphere before the practice began. Some students noticed what was happening and froze, watching the situation carefully. Ilya cast a quick glance at Riley, who at that moment was calmly walking by. Riley stopped, his feet frozen in place as if he were pondering before an important decision. A weapon hung in front of him, and he stared at it for a long time, as if considering something. Finally, he reached out and gripped the hilt of the wooden sword firmly, feeling its weight. He took a smooth swing, swinging his sword testily, listening to its movement in the air. Off to the side, his mentor watched him with a slight smile, clearly waiting to see what would happen next. Riley swung his sword with powerful speed, the air around him vibrating from his movement. The students watched him in surprise, not expecting much from his punch. One of them muttered perplexedly that there was nothing remarkable about it, trying to hide the confusion. However, one of the instructors watched carefully, noting that the technique was a bit rough. Another mentor remarked that despite this, his strut was almost up to standard. Ilya watched carefully, her gaze focused and a little tense. Some students whispered, mocking Riley, for he had never held a sword before. One of them snorted loudly, saying that the one was only trying to look cool but was actually stupid. At that moment someone stepped forward, and someone's voice said Lloyd's name with surprise. The girl turned sharply upon hearing that name, her expression changing to a wary one. The loud voice made Riley wary, he was suddenly being challenged to a duel. Those present gasped as Lloyd stepped forward confidently, defiantly in front of everyone. The expressions on the faces of the spectators changed to shocked, for no one had expected such a turn. Riley looked on with slight confusion, realizing the situation he was in. He quickly shifted his gaze to the side, assessing the situation and pondering how to proceed. The mentor nodded quietly, showing no approval or objection to the upcoming fight. There was a tense silence in the room as everyone waited for Riley's response to the challenge. Riley confidently raised his head and loudly announced that he was accepting the duel, ready for battle. The surrounding people froze as the two opponents stood opposite each other, swords already at the ready. However, the instructor loudly interrupted them, reminding them that duels were only possible after formal training. One of the students asked in bewilderment why Lloyd had decided to challenge Riley to a duel. The instructor reminded him that order is important in combat, but the mentor acknowledged with a smile that there are exceptions. Calmly watching both opponents, the mentor authorized the duel, officially announcing its start. He warned that he would intervene if he thought the fight was becoming dangerous and asked if they agreed. Riley and Lloyd, looking into each other's eyes, simultaneously confirmed that they accepted those terms. The mentor gave the command to begin, and the fight instantly erupted, filled with tension. Lloyd dashed forward with lightning speed, forcing Riley to struggle to raise his sword for defense. His attack was swift, the sword coming down with force, threatening to break through the defenses. Lloyd's eyes read confidence, he attacked without hesitation, completely focused. Riley struggled to ward off the blow, his body tensed, but he wasn't about to back down. Lloyd lunged forward, his sword slicing through the air at an alarming speed. The sharp blade swept toward its target, causing Riley to tense up and prepare to strike. A powerful blow rained down on his defenses, causing him to stagger and grit his teeth from the exertion. Riley struggled to stay on his feet, his boots sliding across the floor from the force of the attack. The series of swift blows continued, each one coming menacingly closer to his position. The onlookers watched the fight in amazement, unable to believe that Iron was still standing after the blow. Roy stood to the side, watching the fight intently, her face expressing tense anticipation. Clenching her fists, she mentally scowled, not hiding her annoyance at what was happening. Brett continued to attack, swinging his sword sharply, testing Iron's resilience. He didn't give his opponent any respite, lightning shortening the distance between them. Brett moved easily with his sword, but his balance left a lot to be desired. Iron was breathing heavily, struggling to hold his weapon, his movements looked clumsy. Brett carefully assessed his opponent, mentally noting his weaknesses. With a sharp jerk, he rushed forward, intending to test Iron's strength. Iron opened his eyes wide, tensing up before the swift attack. Iron drew his sword with force, preparing to deliver a powerful blow. Brett's eyes went wide as he noticed the swift movement from top to bottom. With a jerk to the side, he spun around, evading the attack and changing position. Iron had no time to react, and his opponent was already raising his sword to strike back. The boy tensed, realizing that the next moment could be decisive. Irene and Brett met gazes, their eyes reflecting tension and determination. In the next instant, Iron's sword flew out of his hands with a deafening clang. The weapon rolled across the floor, making a sharp metallic sound, breaking the silence. Iron breathed heavily, trying to realize what had happened, and slowly raised his head. A voice announced the end of the duel, while the delighted whispers of the onlookers echoed around. The referee announced the winner, calling Brett Lloyd's name loudly, and silence hung in the room. The instructor caught the students' attention by reminding them that this was the last class of the day. He then read the list of the top 10 students, including Ilya and Brett, who were enrolled in Class A. He warned that top students will face more rigorous and intensive training. As he continued to call out the rosters, he named the B students and then moved on to the next class. One student proudly reminded us that she was now in a class and could be counted on. When the C-class students were announced, she was surprised by the absence of Iron among them. The instructor spoke the last name, Irene Ferreira, announcing his enrollment in Class F. Iron himself froze in surprise, not believing what he had heard. Later, the apprentice complained irritably about Brett, recalling his behavior during the duel. Judith stated with irritation that Brett was just using Irene to demonstrate his superiority. She urged not to be discouraged, assuring that they could beat him at the final evaluation. Iron suddenly stared at her, causing her to look puzzled. He admitted that he was grateful for the concern, but Judith's anger at him was a little disconcerting. Judith blushed, started to wave him off, and punched him several times on the shoulder despite the bruise. The room was silent, the soft light streaming in through the window filling it with tranquility. Brett exhaled tiredly, wiping his face with a towel as if trying to wipe away the tension of the day. He lowered himself onto the bed with a thud, letting his body finally relax. Looking up at the ceiling, he sighed quietly, sinking into his thoughts. He remembered a moment that he couldn't get out of his head. Brett thought back to the moment in the duel when he prepared to take the blow, but ducked without even realizing it. It seemed to him that it wasn't just about the sword, but about Iron's gaze, his expression, his utter focus. That punch was all he directed his attention to, as if he had put all his will into it. Brett sat on the bed brooding, while a question lingered in his mind. What does his own expression look like when he swings his sword? Meanwhile, in the forest, the instructor asked Iron in surprise if he really only knew 2 kinds of strikes, to which he nodded regretfully. Ron Tarhall, a temporary Class F instructor, explained to Irene with a smile that he shouldn't expect instant mastery if he had never learned before. Then, looking at his student curiously, he asked a question. Since Iron started sword training later than the rest, what does he have to catch up on? Iron hesitated and suggested that it might be diligence, but the instructor objected emphatically. Suddenly, Ron gripped the hilt of his sword with force, instantly creating a powerful gust of wind from the swing. With tremendous strength, he thrust his sword into the ground and loudly announced that what mattered most was talent. Ron Tarhall explained that hard work is important and helps catch up or even surpass others, but not in the case of Irene, who is several years behind. Irene swallowed tensely when Ron abruptly announced that he only had 1 week. The instructor added with a smile that if Iron mastered the basic skills in that time frame, he would be promoted to Class C. Irene anxiously asked what would happen if he failed, but heard that then he would just stay in Class F and continue his studies. Ron put a hand on his shoulder and pausing, added a cryptic however. Ron said with a chuckle that if Iron had no talent, he should leave the academy. Iron clenched his fists and firmly stated that he would do his best, but only heard mocking approval. On the first day of practice, he practiced his punches persistently, tensing his muscles and focusing on each movement. On the second day, Ron criticized his stance, saying his back was too straight and his shoulders were stiff. On the third day, the instructor, watching his strokes, finally recognized that he was making progress. On the 5th day, Iron continued his training, moving confidently and concentrating his strokes. On the 6th day, his stance improved markedly, and for the first time the instructor acknowledged this out loud. Ron watched him thoughtfully, noting that such rapid progress was only possible through hard work. He suddenly recognized that Irene was very different from what he appeared to be at first glance. Wiping the sweat from his face, Irene exhaled heavily, and Ron mentally noted that he had a natural gift. Irene asked Judith to watch him practice since he has a test tomorrow. Judith, grinning, warned that she would be stern and would not be spared if she saw weakness. Iron raised his sword and chopped with force, fully concentrating on the movement. When he had finished the exercise, breathing heavily, he looked at Judith and asked how he had managed. Judith looked at him appraisingly and then gave him a thumbs up with approval. The morning sky was clear and birdsong filled the air with a sense of calm. In the training building, the instructor, looking contentedly at the papers he was reading, heard his name called cheerfully. Hearing the confirmation of his hunches, he smiled widely, realizing what had happened. Iron, confidently holding his sword in his hands, stood in the center of the hall. He had been promoted to Class C. Judith, meanwhile, was serenely munching away at her food, concentrating on enjoying her lunch. Judith forcefully placed the tray on the table and demanded that Irene eat more, for nutrition was the key to strength. Noticing the number of plates in front of her, someone in the audience mockingly asked if the academy had a hippopotamus. Ignoring the teasing, Judith turned abruptly when she heard an unexpected question, someone asking if she was in love. She grinned when she saw her interlocutor's embarrassment and wished him luck with an obvious sneer, emphasizing that he was not her type. Her words hit her opponent's ego, and his face contorted with shock, as if the world had collapsed in an instant. Brett, undaunted, briefly ordered Lance to follow him, and he hastily agreed. Before leaving, Brett threw an ambiguous phrase in the direction of his companions, causing them to freeze. He firmly reminded them that gossiping about others was an idle endeavor that would sooner or later backfire on them. Judith noted with surprise that the brash man had suddenly become remarkably quiet in the last few days. Iron looked at the departing men in thought, and something about that moment made him wary. Ilya calmly walked over to a vacant table, ignoring the people around her. Judith, grinning slyly, noticed that Irene and Ilya had become kind of aloof lately. Irene, confused, wondered if there had been a fight between them, but couldn't find an answer himself. Judith asked curiously how Ilya was doing, since they were now in the same class. Irene fussed, but Judith waved it away, saying that if there was no quarrel, there was no need to ask for it. Judith laughed as she looked at Iron and teased his embarrassed look. Ilya remained the best in the class. Her talent was recognized even by fencing masters. Those around her shunned her, sensing the difference in level, and at night she continued her training. Judith stated with a chuckle that Iron needed to increase his rank faster to catch up to Ilya. Iron, embarrassed by the teasing, immediately threw himself into training, determined. Iron rushed forward swiftly, raising clouds of dust behind him from the sudden movement. Lloyd watched him with his arms crossed, his expression remaining cold and detached. Judith, wasting no time, rushed to the attack with a fierce shout, her movements honed. Her sword cut through the air with frightening speed, the excitement of battle burning in her eyes. She squinted, focusing, and delivered a powerful blow, cleaving the space in front of her. The sword clashed with Judith's weapon with a clatter, and the boy was thrown backward with a force that made him grit his teeth. He feels his hands go numb from the blow, realizing, if Judith is serious, her attacks are almost unstoppable. The thought flashes through his mind that her strength is monstrous, and he barely manages to dodge the next blow. The floor beneath his feet cracked as he backed away, leaving dents each movement giving him a hard time. But Judith doesn't give him a chance to catch his breath. She rushes forward, causing him to raise his sword in panic. Judith brings the weapon sharply over his head, and he instantly realizes it's going to be a vertical strike. The boy bounces to the side, but the blade whizzes right by, slicing through the air with a deafening whoosh. A moment later, the blow crashes down on him with crushing force, causing him to stagger with a powerful jolt. Judith smirks and throws him a mocking glance, as if marveling at his ability to still stay on his feet. But before he can do anything, her fingers clench forcefully on his clothes, blocking any movement. Judith lunges forward with fury, her weapon slicing through the air, approaching her target with frightening speed. The guy barely has time to react, but a powerful blow knocks him off his feet, sending him flying. He lands hard, sliding across the floor and struggling to keep his balance, but pain pierces his entire body. From afar there is a delighted voice. He has recognized that he has become better, a noticeable increase in skills. But Judith smirks and adds with a slight sneer that he's still a long way from her sister's level. Judith stops and announces that practice is over for the day, but the guy looks surprised. She laughs, pointing out that it's already dark all around and there's no one else here but them. The boy thinks for a moment, remembering that if he went to the small training arena now, Ilya would probably be there. At that moment, the image of the cold, focused gaze of the girl holding the weapon in complete silence popped into his mind. The blade of her sword smoothly descends and a light wind rises around her, as if to emphasize her impeccable skill. Quiet footsteps echoed in the evening silence, barely audible on the stone surface of the training ground. Ilya looks up, her eyes glittering coldly and intently, as if noticing even the smallest movement. She turns sharply, weapon in hand, and calmly asks what he wants. The guy froze in place, finding himself face to face with her, tension hanging in the air. He smiles uncertainly, feeling a slight stirring, and hesitantly says a short, hello. Ilya looks at him with a cold stare and asks him without emotion why he came. The guy crumples a little, then holds out a small bundle to her, explaining that he wanted to give her a gift. She scrutinizes the object in his hands and involuntarily wonders if it's too sudden. Raising an eyebrow demurely, Ilya asks why exactly she was the one he decided to give it to. Looking at her reaction, the guy suddenly remembers another acquaintance and realizes Ilya doesn't know how to communicate either. As children, they often quarreled for a variety of reasons without finding common ground. But the next morning he invariably found a letter and a small gift beside him. The guy admits that he himself can't express his thoughts well, so it's easier for him to write than to speak. Ilya looks at him coldly and asks if he thinks this will convince her to help again. Smiling slightly, he apologizes for the inconvenience, turns around and walks away leisurely, leaving her with the gift in her hands. Ilya silently looks away, watching his departing figure, but there is no emotion on her face. The sky gradually darkens, a light breeze sweeps over the walls, bringing with it a sense of the coming night. Later, sitting in her room, she unfolds the letter, reads it and chuckles, calling it all childish. But as she puts the letter aside, she notices the gift and, slightly surprised, leans closer. In her hands she finds herself holding a bracelet small, but clearly chosen with a certain thought in mind. Ilya's eyes widen as she recognizes the bracelet, her breath hitching for a moment. Her hand trembles as she holds the jewelry and an overwhelming thought flashes through her mind, this. Her lips pressed together, her face tensed, and she clenched her teeth involuntarily because of her overwhelming emotions. She lowers her head, her shoulders shaking slightly, and it's as if a heavy, oppressive atmosphere has thickened around her. The silence stretches, darkness enveloping her figure, and a wave of something inevitable rises deep within. Ilya slowly turns around, her gaze still clouded with thoughts, but there is determination in it. She stares silently out the window where the dark sky merges with the city lights, as if waiting for an answer. On the training ground, Judith is warming up, while the guy across the street looks wary as he prepares for his next challenge. Judith announces with a chuckle that they will increase the intensity of their workout today, but he suggests they take their time. At this time, someone slowly approaches the set, their confident footsteps echoing in the spacious hall. Judith squints her eyes as she notices someone approaching and reacts unhappily to the sudden intrusion. Glaring at the approaching man, she asks irritably if he wants to pick a fight, clearly unhappy with his appearance. However, the guy calmly replies that he has something to say and offers to listen to him. He turns to Irene Ferreira, bluntly stating that he wants to talk to him as well. After a brief pause, he adds that he intends to interact with him more often, to Judith's bewilderment. Irene admits that during recent tests he noticed a level of concentration in him that he himself does not possess. In exchange, he offers to teach him swordsmanship, wanting them both to become stronger. A quiet murmur begins to echo around them, the watchers watching their conversation closely, tension rising. Judith raises her weapon in disbelief and asks sharply what his real intentions are. She recalls that he's already tested Irene in a duel, and suspects he just wants to use him now. Guy repeats Judith's words about wanting to use Irene, as if pondering their meaning. He then calmly agrees, confirming her suspicions, causing her to react violently. She exclaims indignantly, calling him shameless, but he only chuckles and asks what's wrong with that. Adding that he could train alone, he still admits it's not as effective. He lowers his gaze to the weapon, realizing that such methods simply don't work in this place. The guy explains that it's not a one-sided benefit they can use him to, as he uses them. He thinks Judith is limiting herself by only training with Irene, and encourages her to take a broader view. With sudden determination, he declares that he sees this as an opportunity to grow, learn and compete with the strongest. Some people around him discuss his words in amazement, amazed that a student from Class A is saying this to Class C. After a brief pause, Judith agrees, but is shocked when Irene clarifies if she's okay with that decision. Irene looks doubtfully at his interlocutor and admits that he is inferior in everything, not realizing what he could teach him. But the man only smiles and repeats that Irene has something that he himself does not have. He admits that he's been pondering it since the midterms without finding an answer. He wonders why, having trained the same way, the difference between the two is still so big. And suddenly a realization hits him: the clue lies in a trait of Irene's that he himself does not possess. Everyone has the same amount of time to train, but Irene uses it differently. Guy is perplexed as to how he maintains such concentration from the beginning to the end of each class. Irene stammered, not knowing how to explain it, for he had never thought about it himself. Judith observes doubtfully that such answers are often given by true geniuses, making Irene embarrassed. But the interlocutor only smiles and firmly states that in his eyes, that's exactly what iron is. The guy announces that he's leaving for a personal training session, and with a smile reminds Judith that she'll join tomorrow. Judith is immediately outraged, stating that she didn't actually agree, but her protests are ignored. Already moving away, he suddenly stops, tossing Iron a last bit of unexpected advice. He advises him to stop belittling himself, because as a member of a noble family he should be more confident. Irene listens confusedly, and then awkwardly thinks that he seems to be the only one who finds this speech overly pathos. Guy notices Iron's mistake and points out that his hands are moving too fast, unbalancing the punch. He explains that you need to engage not only your hands but also your body to avoid unnecessary movements. Demonstrating proper technique, he makes a precise and smooth lunge, showing how to strike. After finishing his training, he suggests to Judith that they have a duel, but she irritably refuses. Irene remarks with a smile that since she didn't even whine, her stubbornness will last a week at most. Judith eats with gusto, paying no attention to Iron, who sits across from her and is immersed in his own thoughts. Suddenly he notices footsteps approaching and turns around, his gaze immediately focusing on the figure that has entered. Ilya appears in front of him. She approaches calmly with a tray in her hands, causing him a slight look of surprise. Sitting down next to him, she thanks him for the letter without too much emotion, causing Iron to be confused. Judith immediately notices his reaction and asks him with a smirk if he has confessed his feelings, which makes him immediately blush. The night wind gently swayed the trees, the starry sky spread over the world, enveloping it in silence. Irene lies in bed, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, his thoughts returning to the conversation about concentration. He ponders how he can improve this skill, realizing that Brett's words are indeed worth paying attention to. If he could develop his concentration even more, he could finally get closer to his goal. Suddenly, a picture pops up in front of his eyes, a man with a huge sword practicing all alone. Irene looks around, not realizing what's going on, and wonders if this is a dream. He raises his hands and feels a slight tingling in his fingers, realizing the sensation is all too real. Clenching his fist, he realizes that these are not just hands, every cell of his body feels an unknown force. The same man appears in front of him again, his movements filled with continuous tension and tremendous concentration. Irene opens her eyes abruptly, jumps up from the bed in fear and cries out in panic as she tries to realize what she's seeing. Irene breathes heavily, shifting her gaze to the window, and notices that it's still night outside. He fears the strange sensation will fade away, and decides to grab the sword before it fades away. The night sky is gradually replaced by morning light, the majestic walls of the academy welcoming the new day. Judith stares at him intently and asks him suspiciously what he does at night. He gets distracted again during practice, and Brett irritably reminds him not to lose concentration in the duel. Brett looks irritably at Iron, reminding him that he himself had just told him not to get distracted during the duel. Judith is also perplexed, noticing that Irene is just lying on the table as if completely exhausted. In the silence of the room, Iron rises slowly, his movements smooth, but there is a sense of unusual concentration in them. He draws his sword, takes a swing, and the blade cleaves the air with such precision that it seems to move otherwise. But in the next second, Irene suddenly loses her strength and falls back onto the bench, causing Brett to be completely bewildered. Judith snorts as she looks at Iron and reminds him with a smirk that she told him how weird he is, right? Irene notices the approaching footsteps, rises, and hears the question of what he is doing now. With an embarrassed smile, he admits that he's trying to practice concentration, though he hasn't been successful yet. Brett suggests that this is similar to the meditation used by priests for mind control. Encouraged, he immediately decides to try it himself, but instead just falls on the bench. Brett lies back, listening to his senses, and is surprised that it's not as complicated as he thought. He tries to calm down even more, striving to reach a state of complete focus. Suddenly a vague image appears before his mental gaze and someone insistently says the name Lloyd. As he wakes up, he hears Judith mockingly remark that from the outside he looked like he was just sleeping. The other guy asks with a smirk if he meditates often, drooling and snoring, causing Brett to hastily wipe his mouth. Brett suddenly realizes that his posture was wrong and decides to try sitting cross-legged. Judith irritably reminds him that she warned him, but teases him anyway, calling Iron weird. Somewhere in the academy, someone is quietly asking if anything special has happened lately. The man confirms that everything is fine, and mentions that Irene has been promoted to Class B due to training. The other interlocutor admits with a slight smile that the sword master was right in his assumptions. The man utters with a sly smile that this year Brett Lloyd is playing an important role in the academy. He gradually makes small but meaningful changes among the students, influencing their development. During the duel, The sword falls to the floor with a thud and the fight is officially declared over. The referee raises his hand and announces the winner. Brett and Judith squirms unhappily on the ground. Rising to her feet, she screams with rage that this doesn't count and demands an immediate rematch. The judge's loud voice calls out to Judith, causing her to flinch and lower her gaze in embarrassment. But she quickly comes to her senses, points to Brett, and announces that the next fight will be right after class. The referee watches them and thinks admiringly that both are improving at an incredible rate. Brett in particular stands out. He is gradually outperforming Judith, who has always aimed high. Clenching his fist, he smiles with satisfaction as he feels his skills steadily increasing. Brett clenches his fist, feeling the strength in his hands, and thinks that if he keeps this up, he'll get even stronger. He casts a sidelong glance, pondering if it's possible that he really is approaching a new level. Meanwhile, Ilya stands confidently with sword in hand, her movements precise and her stance flawless. Somewhere far away, a man with a huge sword makes a mighty swing, his power felt even at a distance. Iron sighed deeply, realizing that he had improved noticeably through meditation, becoming much stronger than before. Irene wipes the sweat from his forehead, but feels that it's still not enough. He needs to get even stronger. Footsteps sound behind him and someone notices that he's too fixated on vertical strikes. Brett stops him, informing him that they have been summoned by the sword master and training is temporarily suspended. Irene is surprised to hear that they are to gather in the martial arts hall instead of the auditorium. As they enter, they are greeted by an impressive crowd of students chattering in anticipation of something important. The old man reminds the students with a warm smile that it has been 9 months since they entered the academy. He praises them for their perseverance in trials and hard training, noting their growth with pride. He then informs them that it's time for the final evaluation, causing Irene and the others to tense up. Unlike the midterms, this test is not quantifiable and will be more abstract. With a squinted eye, he emphasizes that the most important thing in the final grade is to see the true potential of the students. Irene tenses up, but he hears them trying to calm him down, reminding him that it's not as hard as it seems. The old man smiles and explains that they need to demonstrate the style of fencing they are most confident in. He encourages them to use any methods available to show all they can do. With a confident speech, he inspires the students, assuring them that everyone has a chance to reach their full potential. Throwing off his cape, he gets into a fighting stance, announcing that he has prepared a special gift for them. Irene looks at the old man carefully, listening to his words about it being just a sword dance. The old man smiles softly, hoping the students can get something useful out of this. He then takes a step forward, raising his sword, and a blinding light begins to shine around him. Ilya freezes, her eyes widening in amazement as she watches this incredible movement. The sword cuts through the air with a powerful, smooth arc, leaving a glittering trail behind it. Judith and those around her are frozen in shock, unable to believe their eyes at what they are seeing. The old man continues to move, his sword cutting through the air, creating powerful whirlwinds. Irene stares at the scene, his back tense and his thoughts immersed in what is happening. The old man glances away for a moment, gauging the students' reactions. He takes a confident step forward, his presence pressing like something unimaginable. The old man completes his sword dance, leaving behind a swirl of energy and absolute silence. Brett is silent as he looks at it, his face focused and the tension in his eyes readable. The old man calmly walks away, announcing that his demonstration has come to an end. He pauses among the students, wishing them luck, his words sounding deep and weighty. One of the onlookers whispers in confusion, trying to realize what just happened. One of the students looks at his sword in confusion, realizing something important. He says confusedly that he doesn't understand the point of his fencing. Sunlight softly illuminates the walls of the academy, filling the morning with tranquility. Judith exhales tiredly and offers to take a break, sitting down on the bench. Brett recalls the master sword dance from yesterday and admires its beauty. Judith frowns, feeling awkward and berating herself for her own thoughts. Brett notices her mood and asks with a chuckle if she's in a mood. He confidently states that it's all because of Irene, making her wince. Judith doesn't answer right away, only sighing heavily, trying to hide her worry. Brett, looking away, ponders whether Irene can pass the test, but convinces himself that he can do it. Judith looks at Brett indignantly, not understanding how he knows the criteria for the final grade. She quickly misfires, but then, a little confused, still cites potential ability as the key factor. Brett smiles and repeats the word, turning around as if to finally confirm his hunch. He explains that this time it is not current skill that is being evaluated, but the growth and perspective of the students. Noticing her hesitation, he confidently states that it's Irene and that she has nothing to worry about. Judith is pleased, she is confident that she can now train safely and take first place. Brett immediately objects, saying that Ilya Lindsay will win again, which irritates Judith. He explains that Ilya belongs to a great warrior family and is trained in exceptional swordsmanship. Judith angrily argues that this shouldn't stop others from aiming for first place. Angry even more, she demands an explanation. If the outcome is a foregone conclusion, then why have a final? Brett is skeptical of the Lindsay family, believing their reputation to be exaggerated. He emphasizes that even Ilya's older brother is defeated by the common orphan, and she herself is insecure. Judith turns sharply, noticing something odd about his behavior. While they are talking, Ilya happens to be nearby, and she seems to have heard everything. One of the observing students is alarmed to realize that the situation is taking a dangerous turn. Ilya stares with a cold, piercing gaze, radiating a tense calm before the impending conflict. She confidently states that other people's words behind her back have no effect on her. Judith, angered by this response, demands to prove her words in battle, challenging Ilya to a duel. Brett, observing the situation, notices that the confrontation between the two looks like it will continue. He confidently states that he does not need the family tradition of fencing and is capable of proving his superiority. Brett approaches quickly, his footsteps sounding determined as he calls out to Ilya. He recalls the legend of the Lindsay family's swordsmanship style, named after a victory over an ancient demon lord. Ilya looks at him with cold calmness and asks why he's suddenly bringing it up. Brett smirks, admitting he'd like to see this legendary skill in action. Ilya rejects his request by turning around, but Brett only replies with a smile that it is quite unfortunate. Brett looks directly at Ilya, stating that if she doesn't show the sword of heaven, first place will go to him. His words hit Ilya, causing her to look up tensely and freeze in place. Meanwhile, Iron, breathing heavily, finishes another training session, his sword trembling in his hands from fatigue. He frowns, sensing something is wrong, but can't quite figure out exactly what it is. A dark silhouette flickers in the back of her mind, and Iron realizes she's been losing touch with the feeling lately.